Now you're able to share your screen if you like.
Let's see, I think my volume might be. Okay, sorry about that. I think my speakers weren't on. Can you say something?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. So sorry about that.
No problem. I think you can start. Let's just call the minutes for others to join us.
Okay, I can go ahead and share my screen.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Let's see, make sure it's the right one. Oh, that's the one from earlier. I have two different PowerPoints and make sure that I have the right one here. Okay. Maybe. How is it that I am still not an expert at this? Okay. Let's see. Is it sharing?
Yeah, we have the screen. Yes.
Okay. Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let's see. Okay. Well, should I just go ahead and get started then?
Yes, of course. The time is started.
Okay, perfect. Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. This presentation is going to dovetail a little bit with what I talked about earlier in the keynote, and think about how we talk with students and include space in our classrooms for rural culturally sustaining pedagogy, especially as it connects to like identity building work. And I'm going to talk about it and specifically related to ELA classes, because that's my background and I was an English teacher. But what I'm doing here, I think, can easily be done in interdisciplinary settings and settings other than ELA. So just if you weren't in the keynote before, I'm Dr. Shea Parton. My work deals with rural YA literature, rural identity building of out-migrant teachers, and just identity building for rural folks in general. I run a website called Literacy in Place, and I also have a podcast called Reading Rural Y'all, where I talk about rural YA literature and to the writers who write it. There's the stuff. I'm also trying to build a professional development business where we'd bring rural focused, rural specific, and tailored to specific rural schools professional development that focuses on rural issues in particular. So that's kind of a little bit about me. If you missed the presentation earlier, this is the farm that I grew up on. I grew up on 80 acres. I graduated with 50 people in my class, and I taught at a rural school too. We had one building. It was a large building, but one building for K through 12. I taught 10th grade. We didn't have tracks in 10th grade, so I had every 10th grader in the building, which was intimidating because that's the year that they take all of their standardized assessments. And then I had regular seniors. I had AP Lit and Language and Advanced Composition. So I taught a little bit of everything, and we probably had 450 students in grades 7 through 12 in one building. There were 4 teachers in my department. And we taught 7 through 12. So that's this is where I grew up. This is where I live now. And so it has a lot to do with my work and thinking about place and how that comes into our classrooms. So I was hoping that this would be a small group, and I think that we are. And if we could everyone unmute and just say your name, and a word or phrase that describes where you're from or where you currently live.
I'll go first. My name's Katie Andrus. I grew up in Lenexa, Kansas, and I now live in Lawrence, Kansas. So suburbs to a little bit more rural.
What word or phrase would you use? Sorry, Lindsay, if I talk.
Okay.
Katie, what word or phrase would you use to describe either one of those places that you think sort of like captures the placeness, the identity of that place?
For Lenexa, the phrase I would use is surprising ethnic diversity.
Mm.
And for Lawrence, I would say connection to land.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Lindsay, I think you were going to go next, right?
Yes. Hi, I'm Lindsay. I am originally from La Crosse, Kansas, and I now live in Emporia, Kansas. For La Crosse, I would say, for sort of a phrase, it would be very much a farming or agricultural community. And then for Emporia, I would say it's very much it's also a focus on the land, but in a different way. And then there's also the university component. So that's way more than a word or phrase. But Emporia's got so many weird components to it. I can't just sum it up in a word or phrase.
Okay, that's
my
right.
hometown is nothing really agriculture.
Complex land relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Bridget, did you want to go next?
Sure, I will. I'm Bridget Larson. I'm from West Plains, Missouri. And the word or phrase that describes where I'm from, the first thing that comes to mind is nature, and then agriculture.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, did you want to go next? You're next on my screen.
Sure. My name is Stephen Kimmy. I live in 300-person community, Teskett, Kansas. And I this was hard to think of a word, but I guess I would say rejuvenation. There's a lot of community members who are trying to figure out how to buy up old properties and build new homes, or fix the homes that exist on them to try to rejuvenate the community and draw more people in.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Earl, did you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Earl Legleiter. I work at Fort Hays State University. I grew up in Liebenthal, which is just south of La Crosse. I went to La Crosse High School, by the way, Lindsay. But yeah, and the word I think that I would describe is Vogeldeutsch, which is the ethnic group that lives in the north part of Rush County. It doesn't describe all of Rush County, the county that Lindsay and I grew up in. But in terms of a language, culture, and so on, I think it describes the people.
Okay, I like it. Thank you so much for sharing. Kendall, would you like to go?
Sure. Okay, so I'm from Wichita, Kansas. And I would say that a word, I guess, I don't know, I guess where I was from, I'm from the West Side, and I felt like we had a really good community over there. So I guess family oriented in that way. Or
Okay.
Oriented.
Okay. Yeah. Nishan, I know you just joined us, and I'm sorry if I totally annihilated your name. But would you like to share where you're from, and say your name so I know how to say it, and then a word or phrase that describes where you're from.
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Nushin, and I'm from Iran. I'm a graduate research assistant here at REC. So I'm very excited to be here. And sorry, what was the question? A word to describe myself?
A
I
word to
just
describe where
joined,
you're from.
so I,
No, that's
what,
okay. I
okay.
know. I'm putting you on the spot, and that's totally, you're doing great. A
Thank
word
you.
or phrase that describes where you're from.
Ready?
Okay.
Iran is so beautiful country, and also, I don't know, very misunderstood.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you all for sharing. I like to do this because I like how we start to sort of build a definition of place through these words or phrases that we choose. So there was lots of connections to land and sort of like the landscape and geography or topography of places. There's also the intersection and interaction between humans, like with one another, and also humans with the nature and the landscape. And so we start to kind of come up with a definition of place, of how we would define what that is. And usually it's more than just a location on a map, or more than longitude and latitude. So sort of getting us into what I want to talk about and what I want to do together in this presentation. In my dissertation research, one of my participants, who was from rural coastal South Carolina and identified as Gullah Geechee, said, if we're going to be the kind of people who are moving toward culturally sustaining practices, then we got to see that there's more than just whatever the dominant narrative is, which is urban and suburban. Like when we think about it, rural is not, even though much of this country is rural, it's not the dominant narrative. It's not even a narrative. It's a narrative often left out of conversations. And so my presentation earlier, thinking about how we get toward culturally sustaining practices, sort of stems from my interactions with these teachers, and all of them were ELA teachers, by the way. So just sort of putting that out there, that's where I'm coming from. So then what can we do to make our curriculum more culturally sustaining? I talked about a few of those in general in the keynote, and I want to explicitly consider place in the ways that we select and teach literature in curriculum, which Bridget, initially I thought maybe might not be your thing, but y'all read The Benefits of Being an Octopus, which is a great book, and is definitely one I would consider using in a unit like this, or with activities that I'm going to talk about. And so maybe, hopefully, it'll still be beneficial for you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So I've already sort of started to talk about this, but I'm curious, like if you had to define place, like right now, like if Webster was here and was like, we're going to put your definition of place in the dictionary, how would you define it? And it doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be right. I really like the knee-jerk reaction response. So whatever it is that came first to your mind, if you could just drop that in the chat. We'll take a couple of minutes to think together about what place is, and how we define that. Okay, location in space. All right. Yeah. I didn't read it, but on the last slide, Bridget, there was a quote by a humanistic geographer. Yeah. Like a critical geographer who thinks about geography in more humanistic ways. Doreen Massey, who's wonderful. Her work is amazing, but she talks about how like the way usually home is defined by people who've left it. And so thinking about like what that means in terms of place. So, okay, defined area, position, where you feel at peace. I like that. So like where you feel comfortable. I think that especially connects to home. So I think all of us usually tend to think about place as latitude and longitude, as like where you can drop a pin and like that's a place. But that sort of leaves out all of these other things that make place what it is, that give identity to place, and how that identity of place then shapes the identity of the people who are in that place. And so the first comment from Katie, your location in space, it's also kind of a location in time, right? So if we think about home and that being defined by people who leave it, like I still long for my home that has moved on since I left it. And so it's not the same when I go back now. It's the same in my mind, but it's not actually the same. There are new stores there, like there's growth and stuff happening that has continued to happen since I left it. And so even though that place for me still exists in my mind, it doesn't actually exist on the physical plane anymore in the same way that I remember it. So place is really complicated. It's complex and nuanced, and there are a lot of interactions and stuff happening in it. And so I think the more we sort of open that up, the more we get to a place where we can have conversations with students about that in order to make our curriculum and instruction more culturally sustaining. So I was talking about Doreen Massey a minute ago. She is my go-to place theorist. So for her, place is formed out of the particular set of social relations which interact in a particular location. So place isn't not about location, but it's also about the interactions between human beings and non-human things in that same location. They're collections of specific stories so far. So getting at that timepiece, right? Like, our rural communities are not what they looked like 100 years ago, and they're not what they're going to look like 100 years from now. So like place is dynamic, it's changing. Just as identity is dynamic and ever changing. And then places are unique and special because of their thrown togetherness, which she describes as the unavoidable challenge of negotiating a here and now itself that draws on a history and a geography of thens and theirs, and a negotiation which must take place within and between human and non-human. So this dynamism is really important for her, and the way things change. And I think that that's really important for us to think about in terms of how we read, how we write, how we interact with one another in the world, and how the world reads us. So I like to share this story about my daddy, because to me, it illustrates why place is important and why rurality is important to include in our curriculum. So my dad is a big guy. He has a bad hip. He's a professional musician, and I grew up on Texas singer-songwriters my whole life. And so when it came to picking up a place for my PhD, Austin seemed like the go-to, because I could finally go to a taping of Austin City Limits, and I loved this Austin that Willie Nelson and Guy Clark and all of these people sang about. So my dad finally got a chance to come down and visit me, and we wanted to go to the Texas Chili Parlor because of Guy Clark's song Dublin Blues, where he's having a Mad Dog margarita and not caring where you are. And so we wanted to go there, and my dad has a bad hip, and we were walking the 3 blocks to the Chili Parlor from my building on campus, and there weren't much places to sit, and he needed to sit and rest his hip. And there was a fellow sitting on this bench, and Daddy said, "Excuse me, sir, can I be your friend?" And this guy's eyes got as big as silver dollars. And he said, "What do you mean by that?" And Daddy looked at me like, "Why is this guy being so mean to me?" And I was like, "I'm sorry, sir. He didn't mean nothing by it. He just has a bad hip. He needs to sit down. You're taking up this whole bench. Can you scoot over so he can sit down?" And the relief that washed over this guy's face was palpable. So he scoots over. Dad gets to sit down. And as we walk away, Dad's like, "What just happened there?" And I was like, "Well, this isn't Tipton, Indiana. This is Austin. The city slogan is Keep Austin Weird. And when you ask somebody in Austin that you don't know, and you're coming up to, and you're a big dude, and you're saying, 'Can I be your friend?' there are a plethora of meanings that can have, and most of them are bad." So that's what happened there. And I realized in that moment that I was different, that I had somehow acculturated to understand why that interaction went awry. And that in Tipton, Indiana, if Dad would have said that to somebody sitting on a bench out front of the courthouse, that person probably would have said, "Well, come on over, Sonny, sit down. It looks like you got a bit of hitch, you're giddy up." And they would have talked for like a half hour realize that they were somehow distantly related, and then we would have gone on about our way, you know, like, and so place shapes how we interact in the world. It shapes how we navigate the world, and it shapes how the world sees us. And I shared this slide earlier in my talk too, but I just want to share it again because I think it's one of the things that really drives home the stereotypical dominant narrative of rural people, especially this redneck murders are hard to solve because there's no dental records and all the DNA is the same. That idea that, like, you know, all rural people are toothless inbred hillbillies. Which most of my family's from Appalachia, and we wear the hillbilly identity with pride and not see it as a deficit. So, so place shapes how we navigate the world. It shapes how the world sees us and reads us, and it also shapes the way that we read and write our stories. So that may seem like a long roundabout way to get here, but this has a lot to do with the way that we teach reading and writing in our classrooms. Both Louise Rosenblatt and Rudine Sims Bishop describe how we read through the lenses of our own experiences. We also write through the lens of our own experience. And so we make meaning of the world and what we read and write in the world. Sorry, my 2.5-year-old decided to join us and tell us about his goldfish. We make meaning based off of what we experience in the world, which means that we're always reading through place, whether we acknowledge it or not. I feel like most of the time in ELA classes, when we talk about setting, we just talk about it as a backdrop for things that happen. It's not an actor in like the character development. We don't see place as an agent that like works to develop how people are interacting with one another in the story. We don't look at it as something that shapes culture, even though it definitely is. And so what I am trying to suggest and advocate for is noticing the ways that authors and other sort of content creators create things that we read in specific ways in connection to place, and also that like we as creators also create things in specific ways in relation to place. So one of my favorite novels of like the last 2 years is In the Wild Light by Jeff Zentner. And this kind of stuff happens in like smaller passages and larger passages. But there's a lot of place description, especially in rural texts, but I think in all texts in general. But here, Zentner writes, the early evening July sun blazes like bonfire light on the hills behind the Dairy Queen. They're a soft green, as if painted in watercolor. Gleaming soap-sud clouds tower behind them. Delaney told me once that the mountains of East Tennessee are among the oldest in the world, but time has beaten them down. Sounds about right. And so the setting is not just the mountains themselves, but it's also the fact that the mountains then become a metaphor for the people, right? When Cash says, sounds about right, that time has beaten them down, he's not just speaking about the, you know, erosion of the mountains or the mountain topping that happens, and, you know, the what's the word that I'm looking for? The result of that. He's also talking about the way that he feels being part of a community in those mountains, the way that he sees the effect of not only the change of geography, but also social policy, and what that has done to the people who live there too. So like showing the connections between landscape and people. And if you are not Appalachian, or you don't know much about Appalachia, the setting of this story in Sawyer, Tennessee, then you may not have as rich of a connection to the story. You may still understand it, because I feel like, especially in sort of the larger story, like the opioid epidemic has, you know, a lot of things to do with this. And I think rural people in general understand that feeling of fighting to survive in a landscape that changes all the time, and that you don't get enough rain, or you get too much rain, or, you know, like there's a lot about the connection between rural people and the land, whatever that land looks like, whether it's mountains, whether it's prairie, whether it's fields, whether it's rivers, you know, whatever it is. connection to land, I think, is really important to rural people. And so rural people are going to read this differently than urban people, I feel like. And if you're specifically Appalachian, I feel like you're going to have more connection to it than somebody who's not. Does that make sense? So like when we pick things, when we pick books, when we pick passages and short stories and pull like articles from the internet and that kind of stuff for reading in our classes, keeping an eye toward like how are my students going to be able to read this and think about this through their place connected identities can go a long way into making our curriculum and instruction more culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining for those rural students. So I had this activity. I don't think we're going to have time for it because I talk too much. But it is an example of an activity that you can do with students. So I don't know, has anybody here read Sadie by Courtney Summers? No. Okay. It's an excellent book. It's like multimodal, sort of like multiple literacies, because it's like a podcast, but also a story. Like this podcaster comes in, there's a teenage girl, who has been murdered and her sister goes missing. And so it's kind of like a true crime thing, which I feel like a lot of people are into true crime right now. And I know a lot of my students would have been super interested in this book. But Summers does a really great job of not making the representation of places simple. And so the main characters grew up in a trailer park, but that could easily be made out to be like a sort of pobrecito, like, oh, poor them kind of thing, you know? But Sadie is still a strong character. And she goes into these suburban places, which would be easy to be like, look how great this, suburbia is compared to where Sadie came from. And it's not like that. Summers does a really excellent job of trying to capture the both positive and negative aspects of different kinds of places. And so asking students to read a book like that and then asking them questions like, what do we know about the place of the text and what inferences and assumptions are we likely to make about the people from there? So the example of In the Wild Light with Appalachian America, there are a lot of stereotypes about people from Appalachia. And so like becoming aware of those, even the stereotypes that we hold of our own rural people, I think is really important. And then thinking about craft, how does the author play into or combat the stereotypes associated with people from that place? And then thinking about their connection to the text. What do or don't you connect to and why? What do you feel like you have access to or are missing out on because of where you're from and where the text takes place? And then how could these consider and shape, so this is a question for you, sorry. Thinking about how these considerations can shape our teaching practice is a big part of thinking about how we can make our curriculum, especially in rural places, more rural culturally sustaining. But I think that needs to happen everywhere. I mean, urban books come into rural spaces all the time. I think rural books need to go into urban spaces as well, but it's not something that happens as frequently. And it's something that I'm like really trying to push for, especially through my literacy and place work. So that's one thing we can do with reading, right? Setting is always in standards. Asking students to engage with setting is always in the standards. So you can always hit a standard and make your curriculum more rural culturally sustaining. So then thinking about writing, students can also use rural writing that they read to engage in critical examinations of their town, to identify joys and challenges of their places, and then further explore that in their writing. And one way to do this would be to write odes to their hometowns. Some may not be original to where they are, right? So like we get immigrants in rural places, whether they're from other countries, whether they're from urban places, whether they're from the rural town next door, like even if because of place-based, I love place-based education, but a lot of times it only thinks about the place where students are. It doesn't think about the place where they come from. And the places where they come from are also coming into the spaces that they are. And so asking students to think about how those two things talk to one another is really important. And so one way to do this would be to write odes to their hometown. So I thought about asking y'all to try this, but I don't know if we're going to have enough time because I do want to have time to talk with y'all about questions. But I did this as a haiku thread. Gaston is tiny, in number but not spirit, heart, community, farms and fields, lined streets full up with jagged potholes, Lead on to loved ones. Country roads are home, even if they are bumpy. Nothing is perfect. So asking students to do this and providing a mentor text like this that explores both the challenges and also the joys, because I think we like to focus on the challenges a lot, which is important because those things need to be acknowledged, the problems, but also the things that are already amazing need to be looked at too. So that's one way to do that. And then the last thing is really geared toward y'all as teachers. I wrote an article for the Virginia English Journal about doing a rural cultural audit of our curriculum and syllabi, and included some questions that we could ask ourselves when we're looking at our curriculum and syllabi. And so those are, what rural stories are present? And that could be in ELA or in science or in math. Like, who are we talking about who were rural scientists? Who are we talking about who were rural mathematicians? Because they existed. And they exist today. And so thinking about where we can find the work that people are doing as rural people out in our disciplines in the world is really important. Whose experiences do they reflect? Whose rural identities are missing? It is really hard to find a book about rural BIPOC identities. Even in my tiny little school, I had students of color. There are people of color in rural places everywhere, and probably more concentratedly so in the South. But their stories are still largely missing from publishing. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. None of them are good enough excuses for it to still be happening, but it is. And so asking those questions about I mentioned earlier in my keynote about how rural identities are intersectional. So what does it mean and look like to be rural and Black? What does it mean to look like, be rural and Latine? What does it look like to be rural and queer? What does it look like to be rural and working class? What is it, right? All of these different layered identities are important. And so asking yourself, whose stories are here? Who's represented in my curriculum and who's missing is really important. How are the identities that are present in the stories I teach depicted? Are they simple or complex and nuanced? I read a lot of books that took place in rural places in the canon, even something like Charlotte's Web that I talked about before. A lot of William Faulkner's work takes place in rural places. A lot of John Steinbeck's work takes place in rural places, but those rural people and those rural places are treated as pathological, something to be cured or fixed, or they're just caricatures that are meant sort of to poke fun at. And so students need things that are more than just the butt of a redneck joke. Where and how can I make more space to include rural perspectives in my instruction in ways that disrupt and dismantle stereotypes and dominant narratives of rural people and communities? And then thinking about who we are and how that's affecting the things that we're choosing for our curriculum. I talked about earlier how I picked Kate Chopin's The Awakening for my students because I liked it. But that doesn't speak to what students want and need. So seeing the classroom as this democratic space, and thinking about how our identities and the way that we understand who rural people are and what being rural looks like, how that's making it into our curriculum, and whether or not and how we need to vary that so that the students who are in our classrooms are represented in what we're doing so they can see themselves in mirrors, but also see the experiences of other people as windows or sliding glass doors in whatever curriculum we're teaching. So for ELA, that would be the literature that we teach and the writing that we ask students to do. So I don't know if anybody has syllabi with them, or I think every teacher sort of has their curriculum in their head, and the things that they teach. But if you want, we can talk about that. You can have some space and time to sort of go through that. You can ask questions, but I just want to sort of leave my talking with this, that place matters. Rurality matters because it's identity, and rurality is culture, even though a lot of times we don't position it that way. It's just wrong. It's just bad mainstream culture, right? But it's not. Rural is culture unto itself. even if we don't think about that way, it shapes the stories we tell, it shapes how we read other people's stories, and it influences how we learn. So we need to make room for it in our curriculum and instruction. Thus concludes my soapbox speech. And now I would love to hear from y'all. Any questions you have, any ideas you want to hash out with the people who are here, you know, anything. I just want to have a conversation. I'm not sure. How long do we have left? No time, probably, because I
gonna be in 10 minutes. Just
okay. Well, that's better than the 5 that we had before. See, progress. I'm improving. So, what do y'all want to talk about in terms of what this can look like inside your classrooms, questions you have, that kind of thing? I guess I can stop sharing so we can see each other's faces a little bit bigger.
Well, I'm no longer a teacher actually, and so I don't want to take up too much space with this question / like plea for help that I'm about to put out there from the teachers who might be in here and want to actually stay on topic. However, maybe just like a friend, can I sit down and be your friend type of moment that I'm requesting is I just got hired and I can see that no one else is in here from my university, so it's like safe space moment. I just got hired to work in applied educational research on a behavior intervention for K-8 schools, and they've been studying this intervention. This is the 5th grant round. They've been working on it for over a decade, but it's my job to figure out how to make it work for rural communities. And so what I'm realizing I'm up against is even within the 6 weeks that I've been here, everyone that I'm working with on this research project is really operating on these stereotypes of rural communities. And it's not that I'm not, and it's not that I don't have plenty to learn, but you know, my family's from the southern tip of the Ozarks, and then as well as from Northwest Missouri, and like I grew up in the suburbs, but my people are like farmers, they're country people. And I also worked in Shelby County, Tennessee as a rural educator. So I know that that's why they hired me, but I'm already realizing that like I wasn't prepared for what I'm up against in this. And, you know, I'm just a research coordinator. So are there like, where's my community? How do I access like a support network as I help guide these people through what they think they know about rural people and like not lose my temper or lose my sanity?
Well, you could direct them to my website.
Okay.
Literacy in Place, I do a lot of work in the blogs, and a lot of rural contributors do a lot of work in the blogs too, to nuance and complexify what it means and looks like to be rural. And so I talk a lot about disrupting and challenging those stereotypes there. I also think like if you wanted to, I mean, I don't know what your team looks like and what y'all do, but if you wanted to put together a little presentation, I would happily collaborate with you, and you can leave my name off of it. But there's a lot of work out there. The Rural Educator is open access journal that you can find a lot of stuff in there. I've got book chapters and articles that I can send your way. The Journal of, what is it, JRRE? The Journal of Research in Rural Education is also an excellent place that you can go. The National Rural Education Association, the NREA, they kind of host the Rural Educator. They have tons and tons of resources there too. So you could start slipping in like, well, in this article I read, or you could also put together a little presentation. And like I said, email me. I'd be happy to work with you on that. But I think that that's sort of what it takes, right? Like, because education and society in general are so metrocentric, are so urban normative. A lot of the uphill battle is at getting folks to understand that you can't make redneck jokes in a faculty meeting and expect everybody to laugh. That shouldn't be socially acceptable, even though it still is. And so I think having like kind of like a DEI sensitivity training on what how we need to think about rural people in order to serve them well, in order for this grant to be successful. Because if you come into a school with deficit ideas about rural people and you're trying to talk to rural teachers about how to have interventions with their students, they're going to look at you probably and smile until you leave, and then they're going to throw everything that you've given them away and be like, this is not okay. These people clearly don't understand what we're doing here, and they're just going to do, you know, whatever it is that they know is best for their students. So I think that's another way to approach it. Like, in order for this to be successful, we need to have a different attitude about and a different understanding of rural people, and here's how we can do it. So I hope that's helpful. For real, email me and I'll help you however I can.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
We may be out of time now, but is there any last question, comment, concern?
The only thing that keeps coming up, so I'm in a rural community serving a rural school district, and we have a very small LGBTQIA plus population. And I know you talked about representation within the text that you're using, not only for rural, but what does it look like to be trans in a rural community? And any feedback or any guidance on how to help push just with the community in general, because the community is not supportive. They're very anti. They don't want anything in general. I know I'm making a gross generalization. And so that's the struggle. Like, we actually opted out of a Kansas Communities That Care survey because they added questions about gender identity. And the Board of Education, as representatives of the community as a whole, just said, nope, we're not going there. We just won't do it.
Man, that is so hard.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a silver bullet. There's not one answer, but I think that conversation and interaction is really between community and school and students is really the thing that has to happen. There's a group called Braver Angels on Instagram, and they do a lot of work around how to have conversations across this, you know, a divide like that. And so I think having town halls, having students prepare presentations and argue for why they think these things are important to have, and hoping that adults see these students as people who have, you know, valid wants and needs, and not just think that they know best about everything. I think just the more we open conversation and the more we try to have conversation where we actually listen to each other and we're actually working together to come to some kind of solution. And I think Braver Angels does a really great job of talking about what that can look like and how to do that. It's something I struggle with my own family. You know, like, I've had a lot of these conversations with my mama, and sometimes they go good and sometimes they go south. They don't go very well at all. But I think just continuing to have those conversations, and, you know, if they don't go well and the choice is still to keep that kind of representation out of classrooms, I think strategic resistance and figuring out how you can still, even if they're not in your classroom, even if, you know, just figuring out how to keep your job while still letting those students know that you support them. And also, here are some places you may be able to find what you need. A lot of my students waited to come out until they were out of my class, they graduated high school, when they moved away. And I understand why, because the people who were out did have a hard time sometimes. And that's not to say that everybody was like that, but that there were some. And so I think that, you know, I just tried to do what I could to keep my job, but also let them know that I love them as they were, and that I would do whatever I could or felt like I could to help them find the stories that they needed, whether I could keep them in my room or not. If that makes sense. I don't know if that's helpful.
It does. It all makes sense. I've never heard of Braver Angels. Yeah, it's just a conundrum that I think with the politics and other things, it's just going to get more and more difficult, and it's going to isolate more and more of these already isolated kids.
Yeah, and I think, and that's another reason why I want Literacy in Place to be such an open space where there are different types of rural people telling their stories. And so, yeah. So even if you can't keep books like that, even if students could find my website and I have like a queer rural list, if they could find those books somehow, and you may not, we didn't have a library in my hometown, so I wouldn't have been able to go there. But even just to know that those stories exist and that those people exist and they survive and they thrive, and you know, in some ways, I sometimes I hope that that's enough. Sorry, I know we're probably out of time. But feel free, Stephen, to email me, contact me. We can talk about this more. We can strategize. We can think together. Happy to be a thought partner, whatever you need, because I know that this is important.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
you. Thank you for your nice presentation. Thank you all, and I will stop sharing. Thank you.